Широкий асортимент українських напоїв на розетка. Розетка щоразу поруч.
Putin, for the first time, recognized the losses in the war against Ukraine, and the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed the exact ATACMS. Is the Kremlin preparing the Russians for defeat? And what did Zaluzhnyi mean when he spoke of the beginning of World War III? That's what we're going to talk about. David Sharp is an Israeli military analyst. Thank you for your words of encouragement. Over the past 3 days, the AFU has launched 2 strikes with long-range Western weapons against facilities in the Kursk region. And this is stated not by the Ukrainian General Staff, but very surprisingly, by the Russian Ministry of Defense. The agency said that on November 23rd, 5 ATACMS missiles attacked the positions of the S-400 anti-aircraft division, and 2 missiles reached the target. There are casualties among the personnel. In addition, they write that on November 25th, ATACMS missiles struck the Kursk Vostochny airfield in the village of Kalina. 1 missile reached its target, and 2 servicemen were lightly wounded. The Defense Department also said that they are allegedly already preparing some very huge retaliatory strike. David, why is the Russian Defense Ministry reporting that there were arrivals after all? They could have said it was debris again. Well, secondly, why are they confirming them on one side and most likely exaggerating the number of missiles used? I'm not entirely sure here, though. Certainly the level of escalation, including the media escalation they started, after allowing Biden to hit Russian territory, and apparently Biden, the Brits and the French, is just part of the change in the nuclear program, as Putin stated. So they decided not to let it go down, and since they won't, they will recognize a strike with certain Western weapons implications to pave the way for some action that will not come as a response.
Репутация Министерства обороны России. Скорее всего, не так. Я думаю, что они готовы и желают поддерживать вот эту вот уровень эскалации, медийной эскалации, которую, собственно, они в заметной степени начали. Я имею в виду, начали после разрешения Байдена бить по Байдена и британцев, и, видимо, французов бить по российской территории. Это и ядерная программа изменения, это Орешник и заявление Путина. Так вот, они решили не спускать это дело на тормозах, а раз не спускать на тормозах, то они признают удар с определенными последствиями западных оружий, западного.
That's how it looks to me. Presumably, of course, I don't know what exactly they mean. Perhaps they are talking about a massive missile strike on Ukraine, but such strikes have already been carried out regularly enough without it being considered a response. Although sometimes they have tried to pass it off as a response.
Массированный ракетный удар по Украине наносились удары достаточно регулярно и многократно, без того, чтобы это было каким-то ответом.
If I'm not mistaken, this was also the case with the attack on Ukraine's energy sector. It was explained as a response to the undermining of the Crimean Bridge. In general, it seems that they are preparing the ground for their response and generally support the scale of escalation, and first of all media, aimed at intimidating the West and at the future Trump administration to be even more cautious. And responsible approach to assistance to Ukraine. And I did think that maybe there's another reason why they're claiming defeat, that they've achieved their goals, so we might not be hitting there again. No, I don't think it should. The Ukrainians are putting ATACMS or Storm Shadow missiles there, usually on the basis of fairly serious, this is putting it mildly, intelligence. If an object matches the value, its location is calculated in real time and a strike is launched. This is not a message from the Russian army. Defense Ministry reports are supposed to inform about the success of hitting targets. The sources of information are different, and decisions to attack are made at a high level.
источники информации в этом случае другие, но, естественно, принятие решений по поводу атаки того или иного объекта, я уверен, происходит на
When ATACMS or Storm Shadow are used, the first and foremost importance of the target is, of course, having permission to hit that target from the US or the British. I assume, of course, the operational capabilities here. Russian reports here, I think, are irrelevant in this case. The U.S. authorities have mapped about 200 Russian military facilities that the AFU can strike with missiles, the Wall Street Journal reported. According to the publication, the next target for a strike could be facilities in Rostov region. The AFU may try to hit several military airfields located in this region of Russia. David, that's also where the command center, where Putin came to visit. How much of a prime target is that for the Ukrainian Armed Forces? Where would it hurt the most to hit Russia? There's a high priority, and the question is whether those targets are available.
Тут нельзя знать, куда больнее всего было ударить. Есть цели высокой приоритетности. Вопрос в том, доступны ли они. Это не то, что был прямо широкий выбор очень-очень.
The highest priority targets are ammunition depots, where there is a lot of ammunition. They are the basis for warfare, even if it is just simple ammunition.
Понятно, что речь идет о сугубо военных целях, которые были разрешено бить. Это склады с боеприпасами, где их находится большое количество, где есть возможность именно, причем это могут быть довольно банальные боеприпасы, но которые являются, что называется, хлебом и водой для этой войны, то есть на чем все зиждется.
It could be more expensive ammunition, but are those targets? I mean, so they don't have time to be evacuated. For example, on one target, one missile could cause a huge detonation. There is no answer to that question. Of course, aviation that is on the runway is not protected. It is also a priority target. Even a single Su-30 or Su-34, a fighter-bomber aircraft that is regularly involved in strikes in Ukraine, is also a priority. I'm going to suggest that if we're talking about Rostov,
приоритетнейшая цель, то есть даже достать один самолет, будь то Су-30, Су-34, ну то есть истребитель-бомбардировщик, который регулярно участвует в ударах по Украине, безусловно, тоже очень и очень приоритетно. По поводу командных пунктов, важно следующее. Я предположу, что если мы говорим о Ростове, и речь идет о штабе округа внутри города, то я полагаю, что разрешение, я не говорю сейчас даже о целесообразности, есть ли целесообразность или нет, вряд ли есть разрешение.
We are talking about a district headquarters in the center of a city. Then I assume that there is hardly any authorization to strike a district headquarters inside a large populated area. It would surprise me, however, who knows? I can't be sure of that, yes or no. In any case, a strike on any command post, purely from a military point of view, with single munitions, when the Ukrainians have few unitary missiles and Storm Shadow missiles by definition, it is desirable to stretch them out over a long enough period of time, because who knows what the targets and the need will be afterward. Here, recently, the British delivered a few dozen missiles, and a few dozen missiles are not delivered every month. That's putting it mildly. So, it is important to hit such command centers only when the intelligence gives almost exact information that those who are now influencing what is happening on the battlefield are there. Conditionally, in a routine or semi-routine mode, it is not practical to attack a command post. So there are certain connections. And as for the target, since, as I said, there are certain limitations, I guess aviation, if it can be caught on airfields, ammunition depots, and command posts where the decision makers are located, these are, in general terms, priority targets. Whether it's possible to hit the headquarters in the city, we don't know. I will remind you that we hit the Black Sea Fleet, the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, with British Storm Shadow missiles. And they were very successful in hitting it then, so anything can still happen. Regarding the Kremlin's retaliatory actions claimed by the Defense Ministry, I will remind you that after the recent Western weapons strikes on Kursk and Bryansk regions, Russia struck the Dnieper River, with a new medium-range missile. How frequent could such strikes become based on Russia's likely stockpile of such missiles? And how serious a challenge is this for our air defense system? This is a serious challenge for air defense, as there are very few interceptors for ballistic missiles, including the Kinzhals and Iskanders. As a rule, these are Patriot systems. They are few in number, their ammunition is very expensive, and accordingly, interceptions can only be carried out where there is an attack target nearby. Ukraine is a large country, and air defense systems are lacking when attacking inland. Oreshnik did not add significant capabilities to the defense of the Dnieper River. Patriot systems can be redeployed, but that would weaken defenses elsewhere. Countering the threat is very difficult.
По большому счету он не добавил. Днепр можно перебросить, если будет считать командование целесообразным, например, системы Patriot и Сэмпти, тогда где-то в другом месте.
The other thing is that we don't really understand, at least I don't, how accurate these separating monoblocks that attack the target are. We can assume that they are not very accurate. And if they are not very accurate, and each one of them is small in size, the fact that it goes at a high speed being a standard projectile, it doesn't really matter, contrary to the opinions that have been voiced. So it's the accuracy of the hit that matters. If the warhead has a yield of 300 kilograms, it will not seriously damage a building if it hits it tens of meters away. What matters is accuracy, which Iskander and Kinzhal missiles sometimes achieve. But the Oreshnik does not add military advantages for strikes on Ukraine. The only thing is that if it had a heavier unitary warhead, weighing, say, 1.5 tons, which is more than that of the Iskander, then in this case it would be possible to cause more damage with a single hit, provided that it is accurate. But this is again a very minor factor. By and large, in my opinion, the Oreshnik was primarily used to scare the West, but not to change anything substantial. While it is itself a difficult target, almost beyond the reach of the current means Ukraine has, it is certainly possible to fire Patriot missiles at these monoblocks, but that would result in a huge expenditure of ammunition, scarce ammunition, each costing between $4 and $6 million, with questionable results.
Дефицитных, каждый из которых стоит от 4 до 6 миллионов долларов, и сомнительному результату.
But they can achieve a similar result, if not better, with what they have. And they have Shaheds and cruise missiles. They have ballistics that reach these targets. So there's nothing much to add, except that the peanut is apparently very expensive. That is, we are talking about a missile for which figures of $40 and $50 million have been mentioned.
Цифры 40 и 50 миллионов долларов. Я не уверен, что такова себестоимость для России.
I doubt the production cost, but this missile is a miniaturized version of the intercontinental missile, much more expensive than Iskander and Kinzhal, probably tens of millions. Using it for military purposes with limited results is impractical, but it makes sense for media exposure.
В сравнении с тем, что есть и так, целесообразности нет. Есть целесообразность использовать медийно. Сколько у них есть, говорят, что совсем...
How many of them they have? They say not many. They say 1 or 2. Accordingly, if they want to use them, it means that they can continue this tradition and attract attention in the West in the first place, perhaps to demonstrate some new opportunities, not just what was there. But it is difficult to add anything here. The day before, the SBU and the Interior Ministry showed the wreckage of this ballistic missile Oreshnik to Western news outlets. How important is it for us to study this debris, and what could it potentially teach us? It is always important to study weapons debris because it provides a lot of information. First of all, of course, this should be done by serious specialists in this field. The wreckage provides a variety of data. For example, something about the characteristics and design of the missile. It's one thing, of course, when intelligence, whether it's US or Ukrainian, reports on a missile, what it can report is information, perhaps not exhaustive. So studying the wreckage provides several important insights. First is data on the missile's tactical and technical characteristics, as well as the manufacturers and suppliers of components, which is also critical. Sometimes it is already clear who manufactures, who is a subcontractor, but it is important nonetheless. It is important to know the dates of production, who exactly does what, the level of quality of the product is important. Basically, every little thing matters. So yes, the more such debris, the more informative. This by no means means that I wish something like this to fly into Ukraine. Putin stated that no air defense system could shoot down such a missile.
Это ни в коем случае, естественно, не означает, что в данном случае я пожелал, чтобы еще что-то подобное прилетело в Украину.
Путин заявлял, что ни одна в мире ракета не может сбить.
But here's Israel has complexes that can shoot down ballistic missiles. Is there anything like that in the peanut? We're talking about a medium-range ballistic missile with an upper range limit of about 5,500 kilometers. Naturally, more complex, more advanced missiles are more difficult to shoot down. This is understandable. The Peanut, for example, is clearly in a more sophisticated category than the basic Iranian missile with a range of 1,200 kilometers. However, Iran also has missiles more serious than the one I just mentioned.
Впрочем, у Ирана есть и ракеты тоже более серьезные, чем ту, которую я сейчас упомянул. Так вот, в принципе, в Израиле существует более-менее эквивалентное.
So in principle, Israel has a more or less equivalent system, and some even say that in some respects it is better, although of course it has its advantages and disadvantages. We are talking about a missile for intercepting intermediate-range missiles outside the atmosphere, in open space. The system is called HEADS 3 in Hebrew, or Arrow 3. Interception is carried out on a principle similar to the American THAAD system. It does so at an altitude of about 100 kilometers or more, at a great distance from the target, meaning that the system is capable of covering a fairly wide radius, which distinguishes it from Patriots and similar systems. It intercepts the enemy warhead before the separation stage, which is also very important. This gives additional capabilities, and in theory, this system is adapted to intercept missiles of this range. But as always, only practice or knowledge of some details can show how successful this confrontation would be. In general terms, the THAAD systems, the US sea-based systems, and Israel's X-3 are capable of countering this threat to an appreciable extent, let's say, according to estimates, but it is a very complex task. It requires the use of expensive interceptors, each costing from several million to more than 10 million. All of this is very difficult. All of this is expensive, although in this case, the Oreshnik missile itself is also very expensive. Although it seems to me that now is a good opportunity to test these systems, whether they will be able to shoot down such missiles if they are sent to Ukraine. But the media also say that Ukraine is unlikely to receive a THAAD surface-to-air missile system from the United States because it is very expensive. One shot from it costs $20 million, and the U.S. has only 7 batteries that have already been deployed, and the number of systems in reserve or in storage is not exactly disclosed. What do you think, David? Can we get, if not from the United States, then perhaps from Israel, such a system?
такого рода системы, во-первых, их стоит брать на вооружение, в принципе, когда есть очень явная необходимость. Явная необходимость, и ты готов на нее
Such system
потратиться очень и очень серьезно. Значит, если кто-то готов дать бесплатно такую систему,
should be accepted only if there is a clear need and are willing to invest significant funds. If they are provided free of charge, this would be acceptable. But the THAAD system is unlikely to be transferred to Ukraine for various reasons.
по разного рода причинам прямо сейчас, в будущем теоретически может быть. Так вот, она бы была передана Украине за счет по цене, номинальной цене в миллиарды.
In the future, theoretically maybe, but at the moment such systems will not be given to Ukraine at a nominal cost of $1 billion, including interceptors, at the expense of other more important supplies. For the sake of fighting a single such missile, it makes no sense to take such aid over another. It will be important for Ukraine to have such interceptor systems in the future, but they are very expensive. Again, we are talking about grant aid or procurement.
Безвозмездная помощь или закупки. Что касается Израиля в данном случае, то мы знаем, что в рамках принятой политики Израиль не передает Украине летальное оружие. Нелетальные системы, которые относятся к военной помощи, Украине передавались.
As far as Israel is concerned, we know that as part of its policy, Israel does not transfer lethal weapons to Ukraine, but it has transferred non-lethal systems that are related to military assistance. As far as I know, there are some, including early warning systems. If we approach it from a purely material point of view, then such systems are an asset of their own, unless the Americans can afford to give them free of charge. Israel cannot afford to hand them over for free or for money, because these systems are important to counter Iran. Theoretically, Israel could sell such a system, but it is very expensive. The Germans, for example, were sold such a system before our war. And by the way, it is interesting how all this will unfold. On the one hand, we need to fulfill the contract with Germany, and on the other hand, we need to produce missiles for ourselves. They sold this system to the Germans for $3 and something billion, but that's taking into account the small number of interceptors. And it's important to realize that a massive enemy strike, when there are more missiles than interceptors, does not allow you to defend against all of them. As we know, Putin is also using North Korean ballistic missiles in the war against Ukraine.
Эти ракеты КН-23, КН-24, они состоят из иностранных компонентов 23-го года выпуска.
The General Directorate of Intelligence reports that these KN-23 and KN-24 missiles contain foreign components manufactured by companies from the PRC, US, Japan, UK, and Switzerland. What do you say about these missiles? Why can't we stop the supply of components from those countries that are in fact our partners, and in some cases even allies? It's all about money, but it's not really that simple. Russia and North Korea, in this case, are under severe sanctions, but this does not mean that they are in a complete blockade. Moreover, some civilian products even, as far as I understand, I am not going into details on specific names, some civilian products can still be supplied to North Korea and used for military purposes. Of course, the most primitive stories, when they say that a washing machine is disassembled, some component is taken out and used for military purposes. That is probably not the case here. But there are a lot of civilian components, all sorts of electronics that can be used, and then the result may be, for example, that the reject rate will be higher, because to build munitions such as missiles, you need a high military standard, so-called mil-spec, which means resistance to overloading and other tests. But if you use something civilian or dual-use components available on the broad market, the result can be worse. Sometimes, by the way, it may not be worse, but in any case, if, for example, instead of 95% of excellent working missiles, it is 87% or even 82%, it is still bad. The result remains, and that's what matters.
отлично работающих ракет, значит будет 87 или там 82. Но тем не менее это все равно плохо, да, результат все равно есть.
So, a lot of civilian components and even dual-use goods, when there is no physical blockade, get into North Korea and Russia through a variety of schemes. North Korea has been living under such conditions for decades, and if a conventional electronic component from, say, Hewlett-Packard can be bought in China, it is understandable that if China closes its eyes, it will end up in North Korea, or the North Koreans will buy it through frontmen or non-frontmen in any other country and bring it to them. So there are things that cannot be prevented unless there is literally a complete blockade. However, some things could be done. For example, we still come to the need to study the wreckage, to work with intelligence, to find out how these channels work, to try to influence these channels at the moment when the participants in the schemes, even unwittingly, are some structures, albeit relatively respectable, whether in China or elsewhere. Structures are also people, and threatening to impose or actually imposing sanctions on those people and structures works. In some cases, it will indeed have an impact, but it requires continuous engagement, intelligence work, and immediate decision-making. It certainly has a partial effect, but it is a partial effect. In any case, the Koreans will still get these goods. We are not talking about military components, but rather civilian components, at most dual-use components available on the market. But in this case, the chains would be interrupted periodically, and Koreans, as well as Russians, would have to find new ways, new schemes, new front companies, spacers, overpaying intermediaries. All this would lead to higher costs and disruptions. Perhaps production volumes would suffer, and there would be production problems. I assume, by the way, that where sanctions are enforced more or less effectively, this is what is happening. Except that it is difficult for us to see the result. We see that Russia or North Korea make missiles and they fly. But if there were no sanctions, there would be more missiles, they would be better and cheaper. So the result, apparently, is there, but there is still work to be done. For this to happen, there must be mechanisms that effectively figure out the links in the chain and try to influence those links in a variety of ways in hopes of disrupting the normal course of events. Umerov goes to South Korea to ask for arms supplies. Ukraine is interested in receiving anti-aircraft missiles from Seoul. Local experts believe South Korea will take a wait-and-see attitude as it watches Russia's military cooperation with North Korea and Trump's actions. Earlier, the South Korean president said that it was possible to supply arms to Ukraine if it was confirmed that North Korea was sending weapons to war. What do you think about this? Will Ukraine be able to get some weapons from South Korea? And if so, what could they be? As in many issues of international politics, this is all about interests as seen by the South Korean leadership.
И понятно, и мы знаем по логике вещей, и потому что было до сих пор, мы видим, что кроме неких законодательных ограничений, которые есть, насколько я понимаю, у южнокорейцев в поставках оружия,
Clearly, based on logic and what has happened so far, in addition to the legal restrictions that exist in South Korea, they can be lifted or limited if deemed appropriate. There are also strategic concerns that South Korea takes into account.
Насколько я понимаю, речь еще идет о том, что несмотря на усиление Северной Кореи из-за вот этого сотрудничества с Южной Кореей, с Россией,
The main one is escalation with Russia. because despite the strengthening of North Korea because of cooperation with Russia, South Korea realizes that helping Ukraine could lead to Russia supplying North Korea with weapons that threaten South Korea's security. This factor is always present. However, if South Korea believes that Russia has already crossed red lines and has nothing to fear, then logically they might reconsider their position. If only to punish North Korea and Russia for actions that threaten South Korea's security. But such reasoning should only be made by those familiar with local realities. I can't say I'm familiar with their realities, but the general consensus is that if they deem the damage to their own security to be sufficient for them to do so, to take retaliatory steps that would clearly harm Russia and North Korea, they might do so. In any case, the situation is unusual for them and may push them to make such decisions. But to what extent this will actually be the case, local nuances have to be taken into account. By the way, something similar, but on a smaller scale, is apparently happening in Japan as well. For Japan, the growth of North Korea's capabilities is a definite security threat. Although, in addition to a general understanding of the importance of helping Ukraine, Japan also has restrictions on arms shipments abroad. One can theoretically expect that if the South Koreans make a decision in principle, they will have a wide range of products that could be of interest to Ukraine. South Korea is a leading arms manufacturer characterized by high-quality weapons. And the ability to produce large volumes, which sets it apart from many Western manufacturers. They are partly loaded with domestic needs and export contracts that are important for profits and market entrenchment, so they are unlikely to sacrifice them for urgent aid to Ukraine for free. But if they feel an increased threat from the north, perhaps we will see a change. Of course, the position of the future administration will be very important. The current administration is already a classic lame duck. If the future administration pushes South Korea to help Ukraine, that's one thing. If it won't, or the opposite, that's another. This is also an important point. I would assume that if a delegation headed by the Ukrainian defense minister went to South Korea, and if the South Korean side accepted it, it was not for the sake of idle conversation, but for something specific. As a rule, in case of war and important matters on the agenda, delegations do not travel to the other side of the world without a good reason. In any case, according to the practice I know, this is how it usually happens. So, I would assume that something is afoot. How specific that something is hard to say. All the circumstances are obviously secret, but if there is something, we'll probably hear about it. I'd like to believe that very much. But there's also the question of whether they can send, for example, their military from South Korea. There was information earlier that they could come as interpreters if there were North Korean prisoners. At the same time, information has emerged that Paris and London have resumed their discussions on the introduction of French and British troops into Ukraine. They are also discussing the possibility of establishing private defense companies on our territory. What do you think about this? Can foreign troops appear in our country, and will they be able to help the armed forces of Ukraine? Any help, even in small amounts, is blessed and gives something, even if it's just a few volunteers. It all depends on the amount.
несколько добровольцев или доброволец прибыл на помощь, либо по инициативе страны. Какая-то помощь даже символическая. То есть все важно, естественно, только зависит от объемов. Касательно южнокорейцев, мне очень сложно предположить, что они могут приехать с целью повоевать.
As for South Korea, I find it hard to assume that they will come to fight. Most likely, they will come to follow their interests, to observe their northern tribesmen. Maybe if they are interested, why not? In any case, we cannot say that it would be a serious help to Ukraine. But in any case, it is strengthening of contacts, and this is a plus. If South Korean officers can help in some way, it is useful, although in a very specific form. They will certainly not fight, and they probably won't take part in something like that either. As for private companies, their role is often perceived in a one-sided way. Many people think that private companies are only fighters who should fight on the front lines. But private companies can solve a variety of tasks. For example, such a crucial issue as maintenance of airplanes or other equipment, which Ukraine has problems with due to the lack of trained specialists. These kinds of private companies, I'm pretty sure there are all sorts of places and pain points where they could help, while not even being on the front lines, although possibly being targets for potential strikes. Citizens of different countries can act on their own, but that would be a violation of laws. And here it would be easier for Western countries to make such decisions, to give permission or not to prevent those who are willing and able to act in such a way. When we talk about volunteers who come and fight in the ranks of the AFU, these are not private companies, but the country does not interfere with them. As for the troops and the French and British talking, I take them as an attempt to pressure Russia, an attempt to make it clear that if Russia goes too far, the countries supporting Ukraine can do the same. But that's all talk, while there's room for discussion.
Я их воспринимаю все же именно посылки военных, тем более посылки военных на линию фронта. Что тут можно сказать? Это, на мой взгляд, это попытка такого же медийного давления на Россию. То есть попытка дать России понять, что если она зайдет далеко...
It's a step up from nothing that's been discussed. But the question is how close they are to a decision to send someone in to literally go to war. In my opinion, they are far from that decision. However, there are intermediate possibilities, such as sending instructors to Ukrainian territory or maintenance personnel outside of the company.
Однако есть кое-какие промежуточные возможности. Посылка инструкторов, собственно, на украинскую территорию.
Such participation from their point of view will also be quite problematic from the point of view of public perception. But they are already talking about it, so it is a step forward. But there is still a long way to go from talks to practical actions, and they have not made these steps yet. As for private companies, as I said, it is easier, and there is room for maneuver. We will see what happens. Over the past 7 days, Russia has seized almost 235 kilometers of Ukrainian territories, which is a record advance in a week this year, according to Reuters. They also note that the occupiers managed to seize 600 kilometers in total in November. Zaluzhnyi said deep breakthroughs on the front are not possible due to the technical process, which will end in 2027. What kind of technical process are we talking about? And is the Russian Federation capable of it? To be honest, I don't quite understand the context in which this was said and what exactly it was referring to. In principle, if we talk about military conflicts in general, then of course, breakthroughs at the front are possible. Deep breakthroughs depend on the extent to which one side manages to create a serious advantage over the other, concentrate it, and realize it. This is a rather general phrase, but it remains relevant from prehistoric times to the present day. When it comes to more equal opponents, yes, different scenarios are possible. In fact, throughout this war, we have also seen many cases where there was a long period of positional warfare, despite attempts at offensives. that were not successful, or hardly successful at all. Zaluzhnyi probably meant that the lack of advantage on one side limits the possibility of a successful breakthrough, especially due to mistakes or lack of resources.
Преимущество не было возможно создать. На мой взгляд, опять-таки, я предположу, что генерал Залужный имел в виду, то есть некая конкретика, которую он имеет в виду. Он имел в виду ситуацию, возможно, когда...
Even if one side achieves some localized success, it will not be possible to build on it, because the other side has the technological and physical capabilities to parry that breakthrough. In this case, everything comes down to actions of a limited nature, and technological means play a big role here. A vivid example that is often cited is the use of drones. They hang everywhere, which makes it impossible to prepare an offensive covertly, to move troops covertly. If you try to do it covertly, the enemy will see it and use its strike capabilities, disrupting the offensive, which means that the breakthrough will not take place. Such a situation is indeed possible. But on the other hand, practice shows that even with the availability of drones and modern technology, it cannot always prevent a successful offensive. A vivid example is the Kursk region, where Russia, although it knew and assumed something, failed to reveal the plans of the Ukrainians. As a result, they concealed their plans, and Russia was unable to effectively counter them. On the other hand, on the front line, where everything is constantly under surveillance, it becomes very difficult to secretly prepare and realize such plans. Israel on October 7th, having colossal intelligence capabilities, much more developed than Russia's in Kursk region, nevertheless missed the attack, generally primitive enemy, for the reason that decisions were made incorrectly, were in the captivity of illusions, and misinterpreted intelligence information. The result was a terrible tragedy, which may well be compared to a deep breach. Bottom line, it all depends on the specific circumstances, what the different sides have, and what the balance of power is between them, because there will always be stronger opponents. No technology will stop a stronger opponent. He will be able to realize his potential. General Zaluzhnyi meant that now the Russians do not have the ability to attack and carry out tasks such as, for example, pushing 150 or 200 kilometers in a week. In other words, technology in this case hinders the fulfillment of operational tasks. However, it is not only technology that hinders. Technology, by the way, helps if someone makes better use of it. More importantly, the Russians do not have trained, combat-ready units and commanders capable of developing and implementing such a plan. The problem is that they don't have such capabilities. The Russian army is using tactics perfected in recent years that involve heavy casualties and slow advances. They have no opportunity for a deep breakthrough if the defenses have not crumbled. The last case when the defense literally collapsed was during the Izium-Balakli offensive of Ukrainian troops, when the defense proved too weak and the blow came in a very vulnerable place. Today, the Russian army, even with technology, cannot conduct large-scale offensive operations capable of leading to a deep breakthrough. Of course, technology helps in this, because when the battlefield and everything behind it becomes transparent on a permanent basis, it helps the defenders a lot. But it's important to remember that it can also be helpful to the offensive as well, because they get good situational awareness, which also affects how they utilize their capabilities. Польза обороняющимся, но важно понимать, что это огромная польза и для наступающих тоже потенциально, потому что и у них приличная ситуационная осведомленность, и это тоже отражается на том... Also, Valery Zaluzhny said that what we all feared has already begun, meaning World War III, and added that Russia, in its full-scale aggression against Ukraine, is now supported by North Korea, Iran, and China.
в ее полномасштабной агрессии против Украины сейчас поддерживают Северная Корея, Иран и Китай.
David, do you think 2024 could be in the history books as the year World War III starts? First, World War III by definition involves a direct clash between the leading countries of the world or a significant part of the world. That is, at the moment, if we approach the issue clearly, the United States is not at war with Russia, China, or a combination of the two. That is, NATO is also not at war with either Russia or China. By the way, even a direct war between Russia and NATO is still a question of whether to consider it World War III. That's if it does become World War III. It would be so undesirable for all potential players that it is hard to imagine, since it is highly likely that such a clash, even before it escalates into World War III, would escalate into a large-scale nuclear war, unrestricted and global. A large-scale nuclear war is a worldwide catastrophe, and unlike World Wars I and II, when the parties believed they could succeed conventionally, global success in the event of a nuclear conflict would be impossible for anyone, or would be so expensive that hardly any of the participants would want to achieve it. So to start such a war, which will almost certainly lead to a nuclear war, is inadvisable in today's realities. Who knows, in 2026 or 2027, we may find out if World War III started in 2024. But interestingly enough, World War I was never called World War I. It only got that name years later. It was originally just the Great War. As for the Second World War, its official beginning was September 1st, 1939. Today we know that this is when it started, but even when England and France entered the war on the side of Poland against Germany, it was not yet considered a world war. It became a world war later, so it was only after a while that we could officially say when it started. In our case, perhaps only later, or rather retrospectively, can we understand what happened in 2024. But World War III is a special case, and as I said, the nuclear factor is not just important here, it prevails. David, thank you so much for this conversation, for taking the time to be on the air. I wish you a good and peaceful day. Just to remind you, we have David Sharp with us. Friends, don't forget to give us a like, leave a comment, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube channels. Thank you all for your attention, good news, and see you soon. Thank you, Anastasia. I join you in wishing you good news and a peaceful day. All the best, viewers.